Thank you. I want to begin by stating the obvious. This is a city. This is another city. And this is also a city. All too often, we think about cities as spaces to be seen. We think of them as landscapes that are made for the eye. But what would happen if we think about cities less in terms of how they look and more in terms of how they sound? Well, this is the question that animates my research as a sonic urbanist, somebody who studies the sounds of the city. I ask questions like, what sorts of sounds do we hear in a given space? How long have those sounds lived there? And how do others listen to those same sounds, or do they listen to them at all? Now, I argue that we have a lot to learn by tuning into the everyday sounds that surround us. That in sound, we can hear the tensions over how spaces are used and how people want to use them. The politics of the city are made audible. Sound tells us about what's going on at the present moment, but sound also has a history, and it calls that past into the present. And with that knowledge, we can make better decisions about how to build more inclusive cities moving into the future. In this sense, sound and listening have a lot to contribute to discussions about urban planning and design, which, by the way, are processes that we often think of as being predominantly visual. So I want to begin by thinking about a city that I'm sure all of you are familiar with since, well, we're in it. And that's the city of Vancouver. Now, if you think about your experiences in the city of Vancouver, what sorts of sounds come to mind? You might think of the sounds of traffic, the music of street buskers. If you're down by the harbor, you might think of the sounds of seaplanes flying overhead, a typical Vancouver sound. But there's also another sound that's become increasingly audible in Vancouver over recent years, one that can be heard in neighborhoods throughout the city. It sounds like this. Now, these, of course, are the sounds of construction. They're the sounds of urban development. They're the sounds, or so we've been told, of progress. But there's also a very different way of thinking about these sounds. These are also the sounds of an impossible real estate market. They're the sounds of a very wealthy urban developer who's getting richer. They're the sounds of debt. These are the sounds that raise questions in students' minds about whether or not they'll be able to afford to live in this city. For me, these sounds raise questions about my own future in this city and whether or not I have one. And we can only imagine what these sounds might mean to Vancouver's low-income communities and people for whom housing is a critical urban issue, many of whom have ancestors who lived here long before this was the city of Vancouver. Now, what do these sounds mean to them? How do they listen to these sounds? Now, of course, Vancouver is built on a lot more than the sounds of construction alone. We could think of a countless number of moments that communicate to us precisely the opposite, that Vancouver is an inclusive space, one that's accommodating to its many residents. For instance, if you take a walk up the drive during the summer, chances are good you're going to be able to hear the voices of people chatting and laughing as they're dining on street-side patios.
Here we go, right? Here we go. You know what? So early to get it over with.
And if you take a walk through Chinatown most any time of year, you're also likely to hear the voices of residents stopping to chat just to say hello to one another as they pass each other in the streets. Now, these are only two of a countless number of examples that tell us Vancouver is a space that accommodates the many diverse communities who live here. It's hard to hear these sounds as political, per se, but when you put them against a backdrop of displacement, gentrification, and quote-unquote urban development, these sounds definitely have a political dimension. Now, an inclusive city is one that cultivates these types of sounds. An inclusive city is a city that cultivates the sounds of the many diverse communities that live here. It's not one that cultivates the sounds that communicate a sense of impossibility, like the sounds of construction and how many of us listen to them. How do we know which sounds are inclusive and which sounds are exclusionary? How do we hear the politics of sound? And this is a question that I tackle as an instructor at Simon Fraser University, where I teach courses on sound and listening. It's my job to cultivate students who are not only better readers and writers, but students who are better listeners. And what I tell them is that there's no single approach to the act of listening. Everybody does it differently. But an effective listener and an effective listening experience does embody the following few attributes. The first of which is curiosity. Who, what, where, when, how, why? These are questions that we need to learn to ask with and through our ears. In this sense, we need to learn to develop curious ears. Patience. We need to learn that listening is an effort that takes time and energy, and that the one thing we're not doing when we're listening is speaking. In this sense, we need to learn to listen with patient ears. But above all, we need to understand the limits of our listening. We need to understand that the meaning we attribute to a particular sound can be listened to in any number of ways depending on who's doing the listening. Now, in this sense, we need to learn to listen with empathetic ears. Now, I want to give you an example from my own research of how I try to put each of these attributes into practice. I want to give you an example of my own listening, an example of my learning to listen, and it's an example of what I learned from listening. And to do that, we're going to travel to a part of the world that has a lot to teach us about community, about resilience, and about listening. These, of course, are the sounds, it's the music of the ice cream vendor. And you were able to recognize it because it's a sound that's heard in cities around the world. It's almost universally recognizable. It evokes a sense of nostalgia. You might have thought of your childhood. But in the city of Havana, Cuba, where I captured both this recording and this photo, the sound has a bit of a different meaning. Now, of course, it still means that ice cream's being sold, and of course, it still sends children running into the streets. But it's also a sound that calls forward the city's past into the present, and it gives us clues about where it wants to go into the future as well. Let me tell you how. So, when I captured both this recording and this photo, I showed them to my friend while I was living in Havana, and he was quick to point out that the music of the ice cream vendor is a relatively new sound on the streets of the city, that it had only been heard over the last couple of years or so. And I asked him, I said, how could that be? Because I was sure that the music of the ice cream vendor is a lot older than a couple of years. And what he told me was that the beginning of the 1990s, following the collapse of Soviet communism, Cuba entered a moment of profound economic crisis. And during that time, there was barely enough food to eat, let alone ice cream to be sold in the streets. So for a period of about 20 years, the music of the ice cream vendor fell silent. It was gone. Only over the last couple of years or so have vendors like this gentleman in the blue shirt re-emerged onto the streets of the city. Now, so I wondered, with needs as pressing as finding a sufficient amount of nutrition, did residents even notice that the music of the ice cream vendor was gone? And I guess this raises a larger question, which is how important is ice cream? And the right answer the right answer all around the world, but especially in Cuba, is it's very important. Ice cream, writes Havana-based journalist Ivan Garcia, is one of the favorite treats for Cubans of all ages and eras. It's a way to cool down on a hot day, and in Havana, most days are hot days. It's social. It brings people out of their homes and into the streets where they can chat with one another, catch up, and just shoot the breeze. And it's connected to the landscape. Of course, the main ingredient in ice cream is what? Sugar, which has been grown on the island for centuries. And so it's no surprise then that ice cream vendors have quite a history in the city of Havana. This is one of the earliest photos of an ice cream vendor on the streets of the city, taken in the 1890s. This is a vendor who's selling a food item with a tremendous amount of cultural importance. And so the ways that this vendor sounds are an incredibly important sound on the streets of the city. These are sounds that have been heard on the streets of Havana for more than 120 years. These are the sounds of joy, of enthusiasm, of abundance, of affluence. But above all, these are the sounds of community and of resilience in a city that's not being overrun by developers, but one that's being overrun by international travelers, by the growing tourist economy. Now, how would you listen to the audio that I played for you just a second ago after I've told you this story? It's likely that you interpreted it as nothing more than the music of the ice cream vendor. But now that you know a little bit more about its history, how do you listen to that same sound? Still means all of the things you originally associated with it, but it also means so much more. And in order for me to hear that meaning, I had to listen with curiosity. I had to listen with patience. But above all, I had to listen in a way that pushed me outside of the original meanings that I attributed to that sound. Now, I'll never know what it's like to live through the economic crisis of the 1990s in Havana, but I can do my best to try and understand how that moment of crisis and how the history of colonialism more broadly is brought to bear in the sounds of the city today and in the ways that residents listen to those sounds. And what I understand is that, like the voices of residents chatting with one another in Chinatown and the sounds of diners on the drive, the music of the ice cream vendor is a sound that tells us Havana is a city that's being lived according to the desires and the aspirations of the people who live there, no one other than them. It's a sound that has roots in the past and that brings it into an inclusive and equitable present. It's a sound that communicates residents are here, and in this moment, this is their space. This is their moment. And it's moments like these that we need to cultivate if we're going to try to build more inclusive and equitable cities moving forward. Now, I began the talk with the question, what would happen if we think about cities less in terms of how they look and more in terms of how they sound? And I worked through a handful of examples in both Vancouver and Havana. Sounds that communicate a sense of exclusion, that tell us the city's a space only for a privileged few, and sounds that communicate a sense of inclusion, that tell us the city is accommodating and inviting. Now, we need to be able to decide which is which if we're going to build more equitable, inclusive, and democratic cities moving forward. And this is a task that belongs not to designers or planners or decision makers alone, but it's a task that belongs to all of us, the people who make the city what it is. Now, as you leave today and hopefully think about some of these ideas, I invite you to ask yourself, not what type of city do I want to see, but instead, what type of city do I want to hear? Thank you.